Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is my very first page to screen video. In this video I am going to discuss the book The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Shaffer and Annie Barrows and compare it with the movie that came out in 2018. And I love this idea for a video. I really enjoy Berna's series over at her channel, Berna's Bookish Adventures. She has a whole series of page to screen that she's done, and I really enjoy her videos and how she discusses the book in comparison with the movie. And so I had decided to do a reread of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society and noticed that the movie was on Netflix, and so I thought this would be a great opportunity to do a page to screen video. So that's the plan for today. I'm going to link to Berna's channel down in the description box below. Please go check her out. She's fantastic and her series of page to screen videos are really good. So for this one, I'm going to discuss the book first, and then I'm going to talk about the movie, and then there might even be just a little bit of discussion in there about whether or not you can really do comparisons between books and movies because they're two different mediums. I think that's an interesting discussion. So let's just talk about the book first. The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society came out in 2008, and Marianne Shaffer wrote most of the book, and then I believe maybe she was ill or something, and so Annie Barrows helped her. I can't remember. Yes, Marianne Shaffer passed away in February of 2008, and Annie Barrows is her niece. So I read this book a few years ago, closer to when it came out, and absolutely adored it and gave it 5 stars. And so when I recently reread it, I was curious to see if I would maintain that rating, and I did. It's just such a delightful book. It is really well written, and it's just a joy to read. And what I love about this book is that it's an epistolary novel, which means that it is in the form of letter writing. And I think that that is a really difficult form to pull off for an entire book. Epistolary writing used to be very popular. For example, Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, in its original form, was an epistolary novel, and I think it was called First Impressions. And she ended up reworking the book. She changed the name to Sense and Sensibility, and she made it kind of just a regular novel. She took out the letter writing portion of it. And I can understand why, because it would be really difficult to pull off a novel with a good plot and good character development that is 100% letter writing. But Marianne Shaffer pulls it off in this book really well. This book is set immediately after World War II in London and on the island of Guernsey, which is one of the Channel Islands, kind of between England and France. And so it's set in 1946. And she manages to give a full, compelling plot with great characters that you really feel like you come to know all through letter writing. And I think that it is just genius. She's done such a good job, and it is well worth the 5 stars, I think. So it's a really interesting book. So essentially you have the main character is Juliet Ashton, and she's a writer, and during the war she wrote a series for newspapers under the name, she wrote about this person called Izzy Bickerstaff, and it was just a humorous way to kind of get people through the war. But after the war was over, she wanted to get back to maybe some more serious writing. She wanted something different, and she gets a letter one day from a man who lives on Guernsey, and he has come across one of her old books, and he's written to her in the hopes that she can kind of get him in touch with a bookseller. He wants more books about Charles Lamb, I believe. Anyway, this starts a correspondence between the two of them, and she comes to learn the story of Dawsey and some of his neighbors on the island of Guernsey during the war. And the island was occupied by the Germans during the war. And so the types of letters that he writes, he kind of drops these little hints about a book club, essentially, that he was involved with during the war, and it was called the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And she becomes intrigued and she wants to know more information, and so she asks if she can be put in touch with other people in this book club. And she eventually goes over to the island of Guernsey and meets these people. And it's just such a great story. It's interesting, it's compelling, and I marked a few pages. One thing I love about this book is it's about people who met as a book club during the war, and so it really is a book for book lovers. It's full of the joy of reading and the love of books and what books can do for us and how they can help us escape and how they can help us during times of isolation and confusion, how books can bring us together. And that's one thing that I love about this so much. And so I marked a few quotes, a few things that I found interesting, and most of them have to do with books or reading. So this is in a letter from Juliet to Dawsey, and she says, "I wonder how the book got to Guernsey. Perhaps there is some secret sort of homing instinct in books that brings them to their perfect readers. How delightful if that were true." I love that. She goes on to say, "Because there is nothing I would rather do than rummage through bookshops, I went at once to Hastings and Sons upon receiving your letter. I have gone to them for years, always finding the one book I wanted, and then 3 more I hadn't known I wanted." And I love that paragraph because that's exactly my own experience when I go to a bookstore. Is I might go looking for one copy and then I always come away with more that I didn't know that I wanted. In the same letter she writes, "That's what I love about reading. One tiny thing will interest you in a book, and that tiny thing will lead you on to another book, and another bit there will lead you on to a third book. It's geometrically progressive, all with no end in sight, and for no other reason than sheer enjoyment." And then later in the book, this letter is from Amelia to Juliet, and Amelia is a woman who lives on Guernsey, and she's discussing this book club, the literary society, that they were part of. "None of us had any experience with literary societies, so we made our own rules. We took turns speaking about the books we'd read. At the start, we tried to be calm and objective, but that soon fell away, and the purpose of the speakers was to goad the listeners into wanting to read the book themselves. Once 2 members had read the same book, they could argue, which was our great delight. We read books, talked books, argued over books, and became dearer and dearer to one another. Other islanders asked to join us, and our evenings together became bright, lively times. We could almost forget now and then the darkness outside. We still meet every fortnight." That is exactly the kind of book club that I would love to be part of. And then in a letter from Isola Privy to Juliet, Isola is another member of the book club from the island of Guernsey. "I don't believe that after reading such a fine writer as Emily Bronte, I will be happy to read again Miss Amanda Gillyflower's Ill Used by Candlelight. Reading good books ruins you for enjoying bad ones." I love that, and I think it's totally true. And then in a letter from Clovis Fossey to Juliet, Clovis is another islander, he writes, "P.S. Mrs. Moggery lent me a book last week. It's called The Oxford Book of Modern Verse, 1892 to 1935. They let a man named Yeats make the choosings. They shouldn't have. Who is he? And what does he know about verse?" I think it's so great because it just goes to show that everybody has their own preferences and what they like and don't like in a book. And just because someone might be a completely famous poet or writer doesn't mean that everybody is going to love their work. And so, yeah, I enjoyed that as well. And then a little later in the book, she arrives on the island of Guernsey, and this is her description in a letter to Sydney, who is her publisher, of the first time that she meets these people that she has been corresponding with. And I love this section of this letter because it really gives you such a great description of these characters whom you've already started to come to know through the earlier letters. But this is the first time that she meets them in person. And she writes, "When we drew right alongside the pier, I could see the faces of the people waiting, and then there was no going back. I knew them by their letters. There was Isola in a mad hat and a purple shawl pinned with a glittering brooch. She was smiling fixedly in the wrong direction, and I loved her instantly. Next to her stood a man with a lined face, and at his side a boy, all height and angles, Evan and his grandson Eli. I waved to Eli, and he smiled like a beam of light and nudged his grandfather, and then I got shy and lost myself in the crowd that was pushing down the gangplank. Isola reached me first by leaping over a crate of lobsters and grabbed me up in a fierce hug that swung me off my feet. 'Ah, lovey,' she cried while I dangled. Wasn't that dear? All my nervousness was squeezed right out of me along with my breath. The others came toward me more quietly but with no less warmth. Evan shook my hand and smiled. You can tell he was broad and hearty once, but he is too thin now. He somehow looks both grave and friendly at the same time. How does he manage to do that? I found myself wanting to impress him." That's just some of my thoughts on the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And then I watched the movie again. It was on Netflix. The movie came out in 2018, and the main characters were played by Lily James and Michael Huisman. And ultimately, I think the casting was great. It was a great cast for that movie. I really enjoyed the characters, and I know a number of the actors from other films, and I just thought they were really well cast, so that was really good. So as I was watching the movie, I had my notebook with me because I thought, I'm doing this properly. I'm going to evaluate as I watch rather than just get drawn in and enjoy the movie. And so I thought, how am I supposed to evaluate this movie because it is a different medium? So then I thought, maybe I need to ask the question, how does the movie make use of the unique elements of the book? Which is the fact that it's an epistolary novel. And right away I realized that's going to be a problem because you cannot have a movie of people just writing letters to each other. That's boring to watch. It's very interesting to read, but you can't watch that. So movies are a visual medium. So then I realized I needed to look at how did the director choose to tell this story visually. And so one thing I noticed right away was they did a really good job of showing, not telling, post-war London. And so you just saw, because she's traveling to work or to bookshops, and you saw this London that was picking up the pieces from the war. You saw the buildings that were damaged by the bombs and rubble in the streets, and people painting their houses again, and you just were able to visually see the setting of the movie, that you knew it was immediately following the Second World War. And so I thought that was really good. And then not even just that, just the visual look of, bombed out London, but you also got a visual depiction of I think, like, how people reacted after the war, because rationing went on for quite a long time, and of course things didn't just become great again immediately afterwards. There was a lot of cleanup that needed to be done, and there was a lot of hurts and emotions and stuff that needed to be dealt with, but there was also this kind of people just wanted to break loose and celebrate, and they didn't have the blackout anymore and all of that. And so they had these scenes of Juliet out, dancing, and just this, they did a really good job of showing people just kind of throwing off the shackles of war and enjoying the fact that it was over and that they could live again, essentially. So I thought they did a really good job that way visually. And then I also thought they did a good job of contrasting post-World War II London with post-World War II Guernsey. Because Guernsey is a small island that was occupied by the Germans. And so rather than a whole bunch of bombed out bits like London, you get this island that essentially looks unchanged until you start looking a little more closely. And so you see the watchtowers or gun bases that the Germans built all facing out to sea in order to protect the island. And you also saw people who were ragged and thin and gaunt looking from the fact that they had very little food during the occupation. The German soldiers took most of what was available to eat to feed themselves, and the people of the island were just left to eat whatever was left over. And so you got the leftovers of that in people. You saw people looking gaunt and thin. And so you got a good contrast between London and Guernsey, two areas that were heavily affected during the war, but maybe in different ways. And then the other thing that I noticed, because a movie is visual, a medium, I thought, how are they going to portray, or are they going to bother to portray the fact that it's a letter writing novel? And so what they do in the movie, they do show characters writing to each other, and they start to read out their letters, for example, and then they just go and then they show the scene of what they're writing about. And I thought that was a good way to do it. So in let's say, for example, in a letter that Dossie is writing to Juliet about how their society came to be in existence, they meet up. Amelia has a pig that she's not supposed to have, and they want to roast it and eat it, but of course they have to do it privately. They have to hide everything under cover of darkness, and so she invites these people over to eat this pig, and it's on their way home that they are caught by a group of German soldiers. And Elizabeth comes up with, oh, we're a book club, we were meeting for a book club and we're on our way home. That's how it all started. And so of course in the movie, rather than just having Dossie reading out his letter, essentially, they show the scene of that playing out. And so I thought that was a good way to do it. The other thing I thought was interesting, so essentially I would have to say that the movie did a really good job of staying true to the story, true to the characters, while still making good use of its medium. And so, the themes and the characters and the basic plot were all dealt with, I would say, faithfully. But there are things that had to be changed simply because it was a movie and not a book. And you just couldn't do things exactly the same way. So one big difference that I noticed was that in the movie, they have Juliet go to the island of Guernsey much earlier than she goes in the book. But that's necessary because in the book, she meets these people through correspondence, and you read through their correspondence, and you get to know the story and their experiences on the island during the occupation, and you get to know their characters. But you can't really do that in an interesting way in a movie. And so they have her go to the island much earlier and meet these people in person. And so the things that happen through letters in the book, they have them happen to her in person on the island. And so she meets and interacts with people on the island instead of through letters. And so that is a big difference, but I think an essential one for a movie, and I was okay with that. I thought they did it really well. Of course, because it's a movie, they changed some things and they added some things, but I was okay with all of that because they never changed any of the essentials. So characters maintained their personalities, and the major plot points all kind of stayed the same. The movie managed to maintain the love of books and reading, the joy of reading, and how it affects us and how books can bind us together. The movie maintained that, and they had enough scenes of the book club meeting together and what that looked like. And there's a great bit at the end over the credits, and so you can't see them, you just hear them, but it's like you're getting little clips from the book clubs and meeting and people discussing books. And so that part, I appreciate that they maintained that in the movie. One interesting thing that I noticed that they changed, and I couldn't really figure out why, was that they made Jane Amelia's daughter rather than Eben's daughter. So in the book, Eben, the man with the grandson that he's now taking care of, has a daughter called Jane who is pregnant during the war. And just before they end up having to ship the children over to England. And she, I can't remember why in the book, but she goes into labor early and she loses the baby and she dies. And it's terrible and it's tragic. And Elizabeth, who is a key character whom we never actually meet, is a key part of all of that happens with Jane. And in the movie, they make Jane Amelia's daughter, although everything else is the same, that she goes into labor early, and then she dies and the child dies, and Elizabeth is again heavily involved. And I haven't been able to really figure out why they made that change, because Eben is in the movie. Eben and his grandson are in the movie, but they make Jane Amelia's daughter. So in the book, Amelia has lost her husband. She lost her husband in the First World War, and they maintain that in the movie as well. Elizabeth is a great friend of Amelia's in the novel, as she is in the movie. And Amelia is also friends with Eben because she is friends with his daughter Jane. And so I don't really understand why they made that change. Did they feel that maybe Amelia was a more sympathetic character to have lost her daughter? I don't really know. Maybe they wanted to pile losses on one character more than another. I'm just not entirely sure why they made that particular change. And then the other thing that I noticed was the movie seemed to highlight more the complications of and feelings about Elizabeth and her German soldiers. So part of the story is that Elizabeth has a relationship with one of the German soldiers on the island, and he turns out to be a good man, and in any other time, if she had met him, nobody would have had a problem. But of course, at this point, he was the enemy, but she falls in love with him, and she ends up having Kit. And so that's discussed, of course, in the book. And Amelia has huge problems initially with Elizabeth having a relationship with a German soldier. And of course, that's connected to the fact that her husband was killed by a German soldier during the First World War. And all of that's also the same in the movie. but the movie seems to highlight it more. It seems to resonate more in the movie than it did in the book. In the book, although they mentioned the fact that it's problematic that he was a German soldier, for the most part, the people who are writing these letters are people who love Elizabeth, and so even if they had initial qualms, they seem to get over it really fast, and they all seem to like this German soldier. So the movie seems to make the danger and the problems of her having a relationship with a German soldier a little more immediate, a little more intense. Ultimately, I really enjoyed the movie, and I think if I take it aside from the book just as a movie on its own, it's a great story. The movie was really well done. I enjoyed the cinematography. I thought the cast was great, and it was a good story, and I would give it 5 stars. But if I compare it to the book, I would have to say that I liked the book better. Because I loved that she wrote it as an epistolary novel, and she did it well. She did it right. If you're gonna write an epistolary novel, this is how you do it, and that makes it kind of a unique book. She managed to tell it in a different way to most books that I read. It's not unique in the fact that it's the only epistolary novel out there, because it's not. But it is a unique experience for readers in that there isn't very many epistolary novels, and so for a lot of people it may be the only one that they read. And she did it really well. And so the movie, as well as they did the movie, I'm not sure if they managed to capture any kind of uniqueness like that in a movie. It was a World War II story, and they did it well. So I just had to restart it because I can only film 30 minutes at a time. I didn't realize I was talking so much. So I'm not quite sure where I stopped recording. But what I was talking about was whether or not the movie captured some kind of unique element the same way that the book did. And I'm not sure that the movie does. So ultimately, if I was gonna give them ratings on a same scale, the book is a definite 5-star book for me. I love it. I would highly recommend it. I think you should read it. It's very enjoyable. And the movie, if I'm going to do a straight across comparison, is good. It's just not quite as good. So I would give it 4 stars. So that's my first attempt at a page to screen video. I hope you liked this. I was really chatty, very rambly, but I hope I made sense. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you read this book? What did you think about it? Have you seen the movie? What did you think about it? How would you compare the two? It is really hard to compare books and movies because they're completely different mediums, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and I will see you for another video soon. Okay, bye.